You may be thinking that what we talked about in the previous episode is either unfair or pointless. I'll remind you, what we said was that we should be aware of certain kinds of arguments. For example, arguments that appeal to racism might nurture racism. And that's bad for the individual in which we nurture that, arguably, and bad for our society. So I said we should think twice about what it is we appeal to when we make arguments. And you may be thinking that's unfair because you would never appeal to racism. And you may be thinking if it's not unfair, it's pointless because those people who would are not going to be deterred by a lecture by an old law professor. And you may be right about that too. But here's the thing. The obviously toxic arguments are not the main or even biggest problem. People ought to know will be put on alert when you make an obviously poisonous argument like one that appeals to racism. People ought to know, be alert to that. That's why people who make those kind of arguments disguise them in the ways that they do. What's more potentially problematic, at least cumulatively, are arguments that seem on their surface just fine, even good, but cumulatively might be harmful. I call those sweet-seeming poisons. And that's what we're going to talk about in this episode. Now, an analogy we might use is to processed foods or heavily sweetened foods. I'm no dietitian, but many people believe that it's not great for us overall to eat as much processed food and sweetened food as we do. Not good for our long-term health, cumulatively. Not that one cookie gives us cancer or a slice of bread or whatever it is that we do, but cumulatively over time. And every field, whether it be dietitians or economists or other fields, recognize the risk of cumulative difficulties. So what kind of arguments are analogous to processed food or sweetened cereal or whatever the case may be? That is, they taste good, they seem fine, they're not going to kill you when you have a few bites, but they might add up to trouble. I'm going to list a few. I'm going to list 8, in fact, and tie them to the problems they might contribute to nurturing. And remember, the mechanism is that we risk nurturing what we appeal to. And so we should ask whether what we nurture by appealing to it is good for people cumulatively in the long run. So first, selfishness. Arguably, being excessively selfish is not good for people. If I appeal consistently in my arguments to narrow self-interest, for example, ask yourself, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? Or arguments like that. In a particular case, there's nothing wrong with that argument. Appeals to self-interest are at the heart of most rhetorical strategies. But you are appealing to self-interest. And if we all do that consistently over time, we should not be surprised if we nurture a more self-interested, selfish character in ourselves and our fellow citizens. Another thing that's arguably not great for people is a kind of materialism, a kind of narrow focus on material well-being as the route to happiness. Look, I'm no philosopher, but it's at least plausible that an excessive focus on material success beyond a certain point at the expense of other concerns is not great for people. So when we appeal to material concerns, especially when we appeal to them in ways that tend to exclude other, less concrete concerns, for example, by saying, let's get to the bottom line, talking about the bottom line, nuts and bolts. Where's the money? Show me the money. Those arguments are often accurate, sensible, and persuasive, but cumulatively they may be a sweet-seeming poison, cultivating in ourselves and our community a false, I think, sense that beyond a certain point, increasing marginal material gain is a good way to live or the route to happiness. Related to that, another trait, another habit of mind that's arguably not great for us is what we might call smallness of mind, a kind of narrow cynicism about what is valuable and what is worthwhile, a kind of dismissal of more amorphous or spiritual relationship type concerns, the things that arguably are very important to all of us, dismissing those in favor of material concerns. And no one would frame it by saying, hey, I'm going to try to nurture in you a small-minded cynicism. No, instead we say things like, I'm keeping it real. I'm a pragmatist. Don't bother me with all that theory. I'm talking about the real world here. We make those kind of arguments that are designed to counter aspirational arguments, designed to counter arguments about things that are less concrete and down to earth, but at what cost? Cumulatively, if we appeal to cynicism, we're going to end up marginally, gradually more cynical. And at least plausibly, that's not great for us. If in fact, many of the things that make human beings happy require a capacity for a certain kind of aspiration rather than a narrow cynicism. Another important trait is the ability to deal with ambiguity. Lots of important things in life don't fall neatly into categories. So the capacity to recognize and deal with ambiguity in life is arguably an important skill. When we make the kind of arguments that we sometimes make rooted in common sense or enough said or what part of X don't you understand, arguments that tend to gloss over or scoff at or dismiss as intellectual pettifogging, that tend to reject ambiguity in favor of oversimplified common sense accounts. Look, there's nothing wrong with common sense. It's in short supply, and we need more of it. But we have to be, or we ought to be, I argue, aware that when we appeal to common sense, when we appeal to straightforward, attractively straightforward accounts of complicated issues, we may not merely be failing to capture important aspects of the particular issue by our common sense. We may also be cultivating in ourselves and each other an inability, an unwillingness to deal with the ambiguity that is inherent in important human affairs. Very closely related to that, perhaps a version of the same thing, is an inability to deal with complexity. Right? Not everything, that's closely related to ambiguity, but some things in life are complicated, right? And when we say, when we make arguments suggesting that they're easy or simple, we can be both missing the heart of the matter and also, again, cultivating in ourselves a kind of taste. There's a lot of research on this, in fact, social science research. People love simple stories. They're attracted to simple accounts of life and the world that don't force them to think too hard and don't force them to question their underlying assumptions. So we can often persuade people by appealing to some oversimplified account of the world. Blaming it, scapegoating is an example of this, right? Some oversimplified account or of why things have gone the way they are. These arguments are politically and sometimes legally, and in other contexts, very effective. But cumulatively, again, by constantly appealing and nurturing, reinforcing our taste for oversimplified accounts of complicated things, we are arguably undercutting a crucial capacity. Another thing that we often appeal to in our arguments is fear and insecurity of various sorts. Right? We appeal to fear and insecurity of different sorts, physical and economic, in order to get votes or sell guns or whatever it is we might do. And those arguments are often quite persuasive. People are fearful. Look, we live in what is in many ways a frightening world. And so people feel fearful and insecure. But when we emphasize that fear, when we nurture that fear, when we foster that fear in order to sell people guns or win votes or whatever it is we're trying to do, we nurture fear, cowardice, if I may put it that way, or even sometimes paranoia and excessive mistrust. Yes, arguments rooted in fear or mistrust or insecurity are often good arguments. They're often correct arguments, and often will be the kinds of arguments you ought to make in certain circumstances. I'm not saying never make any of these kinds of arguments. They're sweet-seeming poison. Sometimes you need something sweet to get your argument to be swallowed. I'm just telling you, be aware. It might be, over time, bad for the people you're persuading. And finally, I could go on and on, but I just want to list one more. It's a little more, maybe a little more subtle. I think an important capacity is the capacity to accept responsibility for what you do. The capacity to acknowledge your agency rather than hide from it. I think that's related to, but distinct from, doing the right thing. I mean, whatever it is you decide you need to do, own it. Own it. I think that that's an important trait because, for among other reasons, it helps us grow. We learn and grow from our experience if we own and acknowledge what it is we are doing. It's kind of ethical weight training, ethical maturity to face responsibility rather than mentally pass the buck. I don't necessarily mean accountability. Sometimes we should be held accountable for what we do. Sometimes we should not. Lots of legal and policy considerations determine that. I mean whether or not someone else can hold you accountable, whether or not you've done the right thing or the wrong thing. I think it's good for us to feel what we've done, including the things that we didn't do directly but are complicit in. Well, if that's true, then arguments which nurture in you reassuring accounts of the world that disguise your agency and complicity, arguments that say, don't worry, it's not your fault, it's not your responsibility, it's the immigrants, the MAGA, the Dems, or whoever it is we blame, and say it's not your fault, it's their fault, then that may be true. That often may be true. Events can have lots of different causes, right? But if we nurture in ourselves the desire not to face responsibility for what we do, not only might we behave less well, but I think we'll grow less well. So what have I done here? What I've done here, I've listed 6 or 8 traits and capacities that are arguably good for people, right? And, or put differently, 6 or 8 counter traits that are bad for people. So to frame it that way, we might say selfishness is not great for people. Narrow materialism is not necessarily great for people. Small-minded cynicism, the inability to deal with ambiguity, the inability to deal with complexity. Let me add one more. One of the things people want to do is draw on their memory and experience to make sense of life. So we might say the ability to draw on memory and experience to make sense of what's possible, how things go in certain circumstances, that's an important trait for our growth as individuals and as a community. One of the kinds of arguments that is often very persuasive are arguments that appeal to false or oversimplified nostalgia. Arguments that say, remember back when things were better, and we rode in the back of the station wagon with no seat belts, and everything was wonderful. Those arguments, for various reasons, are enormously appealing. In part because when we look back on our youth, we do look back fondly. We look back at those times through a kind of distant lens, and we remember not just what happened, but what the world looked like to us then, what it felt like to be young or younger. And so it's easy for people to convince us, or relatively easy, that things were much better then, much simpler then, right? Like the old song says, was it all so simple then? Or has time rewritten every line? Or have the marketers and advertisers and Facebook posters rewritten every line? Appeals to false nostalgia are about the sweetest seeming poison you can imagine. They are sweet. That's why the AI bots generate so many of them in the social media world these days, because people eat them up. But they may not be good for us. They may not be good for us if they foster in us a taste for false, oversimplified visions of the past, because those are false and oversimplified visions of human possibility, of human reality. So, let me not go on and on. What I've identified are a set of potentially problematic habits of mind: selfishness, cynicism, narrowness, inability to deal with complexity, false nostalgia, irresponsibility. And I've suggested that whether we think about it this way or not, many of the seemingly unproblematic arguments we make appeal to those potentially not helpful habits of mind. Now, I'm not saying you should never appeal to nostalgia or self-interest. Of course not. You almost can't avoid appealing to those things if you are to be rhetorically successful. And in order to be effective in the world, you have to be rhetorically successful. So I'm not telling you to avoid, never eat another slice of white bread or have another cookie. Okay? What I'm suggesting, though, is that we should face up to what we're doing. We should, to use one of the capacities we just mentioned, we should face responsibility for our marginal contribution to and our complicity in the nurturing of habits of mind that may not be good for us. Look, we look around our current world and we see in ourselves and our fellow citizens absence of the capacities that arguably democracy demands. That is, the ability to deal with ambiguity and uncertainty, the ability to transcend self-interest and have a kind of public-spiritedness, the ability to go beyond narrow cynicism and articulate reasonable aspirations, the ability not to be bamboozled too much by fear and paranoia, the ability to take responsibility for our actions and exercises of power, even when they're sometimes remote. So if my concern is valid, if the arguments we are all making are marginally, cumulatively contributing to undercutting these crucial capacities, then we should think about that. We should be aware of that. And we should try, if we can, to find arguments that appeal to and arguably nurture the traits and capacities we need. That's what we'll talk about in the next and final episode. Thank you.